direi che la sequenza delle tesi prevede che il primo lavando sia Ludovica Gregori. Ludovica Gregori presenta una tesi dal titolo Ricostruzione sociale post-emergenza sismica. Relatore professoressa Maria De Santis, co-relatore interno professor Paolo Costa. Se Ludovica si prepara.
Sì, grazie per avermi presentato. Condivido il mio schermo ora.
Sì. Possono tenere acceso il microfono la laureanda, la professoressa De Santis e il professor Paolo Costa.
E forse solo lo schermo, il microfono è meglio chiuderlo tutti.
Mi potete confermare prima di chiudere il microfono che vedete la presentazione a schermo intero?
Vediamo.
Bene, grazie. So, jump to English. Good morning all, and I'm going to introduce with a video the scenario of my project research, social reconstruction in post-seismic emergency.
Mi risulta che non ci sia audio.
Sì, è corretto. So the purpose of this research is basically to develop community-space strategies for trauma recovery in a post-seismic scenario, specifically in small towns, so in small communities. These space strategies are based on both theoretical and empirical research. So for the empirical research, the case study used was a small town of Accumoli that you can see in the video. The temporary village of Accumoli is called Accumoli Sai, from Soluzione Abitativa in Emergenza. So the choice of this topic comes from a reflection that I made on the day after of the first earthquake in 2016, which hit Central Italy on the 24th of August. So I volunteer in my hometown, and I've seen people in my community that I used to know to change their role from like students and workers to volunteers to help. So I wondered, what is instead the role of architecture in the post-seismic scenario? So as I truly believe that architecture is for the people, I needed to clarify how these traumatic events impact the people. And I came out to the conclusion that natural disasters shatter essential assumptions that related to mental health. And specifically, these assumptions are related and formed in the context of community life. So this means that trauma goes through certain phases, which is pretty general, and are then applied also to the case of Accumoli. So this means that trauma recovery directly involves the reconstruction of the social context where these assumptions are based. So the community represents the potential for trauma recovery for its members. And unfortunately, traumatic events create basically social disaggregation, and this is where the research is going to focus. So to put into context these places into the timeline of the earthquake in 2016, identified specific phases as first emergency, and post-emergency phase, and then reconstruction. And we'll focus on the post-emergency phase. So the main events that had the strongest social impact were the stay in the hotels on the seaside and the temporary villages on the back in the original territory. So it was clear from psychological interventions data that there were first individual needs arise soon after the arrival of the earthquake, but then it is evident how community-oriented needs arise in the post-emergency phase. So psychologists of Accumoli were interviewed during this research, and they confirmed that the temporary village's residents started to express again the need to be part of a community. So due to their temporary nature, how and why we should invest in temporary villages, that's the question. So the main reason is to foster social reconstruction before the building's reconstruction. Otherwise, basically, we will rebuild entire villages for people that are adverse to each other, that are not able to share their common condition due to their individual fragility. So in the phase of the temporary villages, there are factors related to time and territory, landscape, that can provide risks or opportunities, and this research believes that long-lasting effects can depend on the design of the temporary villages itself. So, anyways, temporary villages are relatively short-lived, and the reconstruction process, we know it's really complicated. So, how much should we invest in temporary villages then? And the proposed solution is to follow simple space strategies for quick design choices during the emergency phase that will keep a social perspective. So this answer comes from the study of past and present emergency settlements and the observation of the case study. So first of all, it's important to understand what's the context of the temporary developments and what's the current state of them, both in Italy and abroad. So it must be said that in the Italian regulations there is a lack on this topic, and there has always been a functional approach, both in Italy and abroad. So I found just a few recent projects in China and Japan that are purposely aimed to stimulate the sense of community through the creation of quality common spaces. So a social design perspective, I believe, that must be adopted, and this is where the intention of the user meets the one of the designers. So being in a post-emergency context obviously means that there are big time constraints. I've seen that in the case of Accumoli, the layout proposal took 27 days, but people were hosted in the hotels for almost 10 months. So the layout that came out from this time is generally designed by contractors, and they do lack any attention to social aspects. So the proposed strategy should keep a social perspective but also be simple to allow quick design choices. At the same time, they should be flexible to be applied to different social and environmental contexts. So regardless the emergency strategy, the timescales, or the type of the housing solution that are adopted, what's constant is the public space. So quality public space can compensate for the difficulties that people are experiencing in their private sphere, which are even worsened by the nature of the temporary housing itself. So both empirical and sociology studies confirm that spontaneous interaction and community life happen in the shared spaces. And generally, in the studied temporary villages, public spaces and paths as well are overdimensioned. they're dull, they're dispersive, especially if compared to the ones of the old villages, which in this case of Central Italy, they're mostly based on a medieval layout. So there's no specific reason for this feature of dispersion in the villages, in the temporary villages, such as, for example, safety. And actually, there was even more freedom from the building regulations during the emergency phase to apply different space strategies. So this could have been a big chance to focus on community life, while instead the empirical analysis show that there is a need for general design tools with a social focus for the temporary villages. So the empirical analysis of the design outcome of Accumuli was carried out with different methods. The method of in-depth interviews was chosen to collect information on social aspects, so directly inquiring people. And this meant the participant recruitment process was needed. And then it was carried out with success among association, institutions, residents and non-residents. A total of 13 interviews were recorded and then transcribed. Another method was the observation of environmental cues during the surveys in the new village. And this has been done in order to promote an evidence-based design. Another element that was found to be very influent to the level of the post-traumatic stress is the perception of the previous situation, of the past. So to collect information on the life in the old village, which was completely destroyed, a walk-in interview with 2 residents was carried out in the red zone of Accumuli. And this allowed to understand the residents' images of the socially relevant spaces, which are held only in the memory of the people. And then they were summarized in a drawing focusing only on the socially relevant spaces. Afterwards, there was a process of selection and interpretation of the features of the studied spaces of the old village. And these had to be, features had to become design inputs to promote social life in the temporary villages. So these inputs concern functions, users, public space and street types. And they all come from an analysis of the meeting spaces, gathering spaces, or even the main streets of the old town. So to summarize this information, the public spaces have been represented with just few main elements that used to influence the people's space. And this is based on the residents' description and sociology theoretical background. In addition, also the location of the social gathering space is important. That means that walking distances between buildings and other public spaces was very important and has been studied in this research. So the analysis then, this type of analysis then applied also to the new temporary village to understand from the design outcome. So this analysis has been carried out as almost like pretending to be in a post-emergency scenario, thinking like, what do I need to know if the time constraint is such? And the answer is to have just few simple relevant points of reference for the design, keeping always a social perspective. So in order to interpret past and present into space solutions, one of the main steps of the proposal of the community space to design tools was the process of selection of the factors. This process was based on both theoretical and empirical studies again, and it wants to be a first small step to create a general method that could be further developed for the design of the temporary villages. So the selected factors have been then categorized in interpretation from the past, analysis of the social and environmental context, recommendations for future community strength, and the focus on the people's needs, obviously. So the design approach focuses on creating spaces for community life to then help trauma recovery. The main focus has to be the space relationship between the temporary structures then. So the only element taken into consideration of the buildings is the entrance, the general space strategies, the pattern options, and then the building orientations are combined to provide social engaging layouts. So the space strategy are applied to the new temporary village of Akumori. The new village is close to the old one, but from it it's not possible to see the destroyed buildings, which seems to be a positive feature of the village. The landscape views are almost the same, which is again an element of comfort, as the residents said. So one of the main problems of the new village is the lack of any surface. It is so surprising to see that after 4 years, the structure that was meant to be a bar is not even open yet. It's so evident how the bar and its outdoor space, it can be a powerful tool for social interaction in small communities such as Akumori. Still, this element had no priority over empty community rooms, community halls, or even the big unused school of Akumori. A commercial and a service space was instead built downhill at 4 kilometers away. It's easy to understand that this implies that people without a car cannot go to the bar or even shopping. And then home delivery service was actually improvised by the shop owners of the surroundings. So by being the space relationship the main focus, the strategies of options can lead to different arrangements, and this was tested in the case study of Akumori. One of the most evident issues in the new village is dispersion. So, for example, cluster layouts could help overcome this problem. Anyways, generally, spread out developments provide less opportunities for encounters and social interaction. They also need more land use, which is very important in a mountainous territory such as the one of the case study. So in Akumori, the buildings, as I said, are spread out in the project area, especially compared to the old village. So the overall distances between buildings can really influence the amount and the length of outdoor activities and interaction. So the public space also, within this distance between the buildings, should be proportionally bigger than the semi-private sphere, the semi-private space. The design tools provide dimensioning reference for public open spaces, for streets and paths, and they're based on the case study observation, and then theoretical research, specifically on human perception and interaction distances. So the access to the dwellings, to the houses, is the only element taken into account of the buildings. And this is an interesting area, an interesting point for people to stay and linger. And this is why the entrances are such an important element in this research. In the old town, the semi-private space was a very small transition space between the private and the semi-public space, or just directly the public space. So the flow between private and public sphere should always be made as smooth as possible. The design tool proposed in this case options on how to provide resting elements right at the doorsteps, or how to use soft or strong edge elements to define boundaries according to the situation. And other tools include also how to provide shelter in both the proximity of the houses and along the routes. Speaking of routes, in this research, routes are believed to be also a place to stop and linger, and not just a passage to get to a private space. So the mixed traffic use in the old village was evident by the description of the residents, and this happens quite often in small villages like the case study. If this is the case, the design tool suggested is the Wunert concept, which is a modern interpretation of shared surface streets that allow life to take place along the streets. And this type of street can provide also traffic and also parking for any accessibility problem, as for example in Akumori there are many old people with mobility problems, so accessibility is an issue. So it must be also said that on both the streets and the squares, the influence of the building functions that are facing into this place can be observed. So the design strategy implemented here is to mix non-residential functions according to both their opening times and their social attraction level. So this comes from actually observing the public spaces in the new village of Akumori, where there are just few non-residential functions, and they're open, most of them they're open just for events or at specific times, such as a church, for example. And instead, if they had a different mix, taking into account these factors, this mix could have brought more people at different times for different and longer activities in the squares. So this research has some limits, and they need to be taken into account if there's a will for further development. So this research wants to be just a starting point to address post-seismic social needs through the space design of temporary villages. And I want to point out that among the limits of the research, there's also the level of replicability of these design tools. The proposed design tools are non-exhaustive, they're not rigid, and this is done on purpose because they're meant to be applied according to social and environmental different contexts. So the post-emergency scenario is also considered a process that people go through. So the project itself should be thought as a process and not just as a turnkey finished solution. And this way it will instead provide opportunities for appropriation of space, alteration of space. And this can lead, in this way, the temporary village project can be a tool for people empowerment and the identity, to foster the identity process. So the identity process in a post-seismic context place and people identity loss is directly connected with the building environment loss. It seems like the earthquake is putting in direct connection social, psychological difficulties with architecture. So then the social system of a community can help overcoming the trauma, these mental difficulties. And then the architect can provide quality common spaces instead of dispersive urban context has been done so far. And we know how Italian public spaces are full of life, but this doesn't happen in the post-earthquake temporary settlements. So the social role of architects in the temporary villages seems to be forgotten. On the contrary, they could even collaborate, architects could even collaborate with sociologists and psychologists. So community space strategies are proposed to foster the social design approach, and this is in order to avoid negative long-lasting effects on people and to support the trauma recovery. So speaking of trauma recovery, I would like to put this research on trauma recovery into today's context. So I'm going to show you a recent interview in Akumori.
Tutte le case sono chiuse, ma è una scena abituale, non è perché c'è il virus. Qui lo stato è uno stato di abbandono, ma non per il virus, nel senso tutte le case siete...
So I would just like to conclude that I would probably never have thought that my research on trauma recovery could be so much contextualized in today's traumatic situation. So thank you for listening.
Okay, thank you, Ludovica, for your very interesting presentation and also for your very original approach to the problem, because we saw many times the project about the post-seismic strategy of design, but this point of view is very, very original, I think. Thank you. Ci sono domande? Qualsiasi... Sì.
Posso intervenire?
Sì.
Sì. So, I also appreciate very much your presentation, and I agree with most of your design suggestions and proposals. But my question is, how do you think this different approach to the design of temporary village can pour into practice? Because, of course, after an earthquake, as you also pointed out, there is not much time for research or even for participatory processes. So we must normally afford on ready-to-use solutions. So how can we face this problem? Do you think that, for example, the building up of design guideline could be a way, a solution? Or should the population in fragile territories be involved in the sort of community project before, in order to be prepared if an earthquake occurs? Because when the earthquake occurs, of course, the most important thing is to be very quick in giving a response, whatever it is.
Thank you for asking. It's an interesting question, so I'll try to be quick to answer. So I do believe that if there was a proper guideline to like a ready package of information that we'll need to focus on as soon as the earthquake hits in order to provide temporary housing that will foster social aggregation, that could be a solution. But I also think that this is not ever going to happen if we don't change the approach, if we don't change the mindset. So definitely there's the first point. And then about the involvement of the people, it is very interesting because as from the people words, they say we are so emotionally involved as soon as the earthquake comes in the post-emergency that it's hard for us to actually make decisions that will have good, long-lasting effects. So there's a need for participation approach, definitely. And I think you're right suggesting that this should be done possibly beforehand, even if it's possibly very hard to do so, because whoever would likely think, oh, let's get ready for the earthquake on a social matter, but that would be definitely the best option. But I do think that if we, to keep the social approach, participatory tools could be used, for example, in the time in which people are staying in another accommodation. For example, when people were in the hotels on the seaside, there were many activities done by the psychologists in order to empower people very slowly. So I was thinking that possibly like a community mapping of the old town could be done in those circumstances, for example. So because another issue was between the administration, so the municipality, and then the people, because obviously there's so much emotion going on that it's hard to keep proper dialogue. So if there would be, to just answer, if there would be like proper guidelines studied and tested beforehand, there are like already packaged that people could use since the moment of the earthquake until the end of construction of the village. And then again, also as I said, I believe that the project itself should be a process. So I don't think that we'll have to stop focusing on the temporary village when the construction is finished. It will have to be a tool in which people can express themselves and express their needs that are changing as well. And this is based on the observation of like new little activities that were done, like new social groups were founded during the stay in the hotels, such as a knitting group, and people started gardening in the temporary village. Well, when they had never done it before. So I do think that there's a chance there if there will be guidelines tested beforehand. I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, of course, thank you.
Okay.
Ok, ci sono altre domande per la candidata? Ok, va bene, grazie, thank you.
Thank you.
Ciao. Allora, adesso è la volta di Sara Elizabeth Black, che presenta...
Quando paglio. Ciao amici. Dai. Fammi azzitta questa che tanto chi sta la fila. Bene, allora. Benedetta Libertà, bella presentazione, sì è vero. A che ora è la programmazione? Ah, ma non devo rispondere scrivendo, posso parlare, giusto? Cioè, mi sentite? Oddio, non so come funziona.